Thank you so much for having me. So the title of my talk, I'm just going to start my timer. The title of my talk is The Reproduction of Power Imbalances, a Holist Abolitionist Approach to Addressing Reproductive Injustice and Injustice in Parenting. So I feel like it's really important to begin with a few acknowledgements. I want to thank you so much to Dr. Jill Mueller and all the conference organizers and to Paderborn University. I really appreciate being able to give my paper and also to learn from you all in this session and all the other sessions. So thank you so much. I really appreciate that the conference is held in English and is also hybrid. Both of those things were important elements of my ability to participate, so I appreciate it. So I wanted to say that my paper is situated, as the introduction said, in the idea that we need to acknowledge the social structures and the histories of injustice that inform our current context. And so with those commitments, it's important to me to acknowledge some of those social structures and histories of injustice that inform where I live and where I work. So Bates College is situated on the unceded homelands of the Amoskegon peoples, whose descendants now live among the Wabanaki peoples, including the Abenaki, Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Micmac peoples. And it's also important for me to acknowledge that Bates College was funded by a man named Benjamin Bates in the mid-1800s. And he was a Maine business person who derived his wealth from cotton produced by enslaved people. And so I feel like acknowledging these two things is really in keeping with the kind of core argument of my paper, which is that we shouldn't really think about injustices or social problems or moral problems atomistically, but we need to think about them in their holistic context, both in the history that they emerge out of, in the social context that they exist in currently, and in their relationship to other social issues and problems. So my paper really begins by thinking about abortion. Abortion is a dominant focus, and I should say a lot of my discussion is going to center on the United States because it's what I really know best. Abortion is a dominant focus of the US feminist movement. It's, of course, an important kind of reproductive justice. Planned Parenthood and NARAL, the National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws, are two important organizations in the US. I think the focus on abortion also emerges out of the principles of biomedical ethics, and that image right there on the right is of Tom Beecham on the right-hand side of the image and James Childress on the left-hand side, who are known to have advanced these four principles of bioethics, the first of which is autonomy, which of course includes personal liberty, freedom, and a right to bodily autonomy. And I think when we think about abortion, it raises issues that are especially concerning with regard to autonomy, liberty, and freedom. And if we look for a philosopher's index search, I did this just last week, identify 2,461 articles, books, and chapters of books that concern abortion. So it's a problem that's really dominant among philosophers and something that a lot of people are talking about, interested in, concerned about. But I think there are other issues related to reproductive justice, maternal mortality in the United States. And I share with you this, it's probably hard to see, but this graph that shows the US maternal mortality rate and its relationship to other high-income countries. And I should say this data with regard to the United States, which is on the far right-hand side of the screen, is from 2020. And there was just an article that came out in the news this week saying that during the COVID-19 pandemic, maternal mortality in the US has gone up 40%. So I don't think this data include that increase. But you can see on the far left-hand side, the Netherlands has a rate of maternal mortality of 1.2 maternal deaths per 100,000 live births. And the United States, if you look at I'm just going to peek at the chat. Oh, thank you so much for sharing the article, Amber. So if you look at that dark green bar on the right, not the farthest right, but the one just to the left of that, that's considering all U.S. births in the United States. And the rate for all people who give birth in the United States in 2020 was 23.8 maternal deaths per 100,000 live births. White women had a slightly lower maternal death rate at 19.1. Hispanic women in the US is slightly lower than that at 18.2. But if Black women in the US were their own country, their rate of maternal mortality, Black birth givers, would be 55.3 per 100,000 live births. So the rate is 3 times higher than that for white women, and 55 times higher than the Netherlands, and our closest competitor, New Zealand, still far, far, far higher than New Zealand. So this is really concerning. If you look to a Philosopher's Index search of articles on maternal mortality just a couple days ago, you will find 23. And I want to suggest that the focus on autonomy, freedom, and liberty, which dominates contemporary approaches to biomedical ethics, is conceptually ineffective in offering us insight here. And so that's one of the things I'm going to suggest later on in my talk, is that we need to shift away from thinking primarily about autonomy and freedom and liberty, and that the focus on autonomy, freedom, and liberty is part of what has given rise to the over focus on abortion and the under focus on something like maternal mortality. I also think it's another issue in the US related to reproductive justice is what I'm calling family policing. That's a term that Dorothy Roberts uses in her book, which is referenced at the bottom of this slide, Torn Apart: How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families and How Abolition Can Build a Safer World. So family policing is more commonly referred to as child protective services. And basically, it is the service in the US that intervenes when they believe that a child is unsafe in their home situation. But as you can see from these statistics, that service, so-called service, is not uniformly applied. As of 2022, the percentage by identity of children in foster care before the age of 18, 15% of Indigenous children in the US were in foster care at some point before the age of 18, 12% of Black children, and only 5% of white children. It's also important to note that only 17% of children are separated from their families due to abuse. The rest are separated due to neglect, which is defined as failing to provide children with food, housing, and clothing. And of course, in the United States, there's no significant social safety net to support families in need. So 83% of the children who are being removed from their families are being removed essentially because their families don't have adequate food, housing, and clothing. It's also important to note that more than 50% of Black children, and this is twice the rate for white children, will experience a Child Protective Services investigation before the age of 18. Now, I also did a Philosopher's Index search about this just last week, and there are 2 articles on the family policing system in Philosopher's Index. So it's clear that there's a kind of singular focus on abortion. And as I said earlier, the focus on abortion, unsurprisingly, emerges out of the focus on the individual's choices, on their autonomy, on their liberty, and in the case of abortion, on the potential conflict between the rights of the pregnant person and the fetus. Now, I don't want to suggest that abortion and reproductive freedom are not important. Of course, they are. But I am also concerned that the exclusive focus on abortion takes away from a whole array of issues of relevance in reproductive justice, as we've seen: maternal mortality, state intrusions into parenting, especially for Black, Brown, and Indigenous families. So my paper is really about how we can avoid this narrow and exclusive focus on just one aspect of reproductive justice. So I think it's important to begin by thinking about the values underlying issues of reproductive justice. So we've seen the principles of biomedical ethics. I mentioned before the principle of autonomy. The three other principles defended by Tom Beecham and Jim Childress are non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. I apologize. I got COVID a couple days ago, so I'm just kind of eating cough drops here to make sure I don't cough too much. So those principles are lexically ordered, where autonomy is thought to be the most important. And so when we have that first principle of autonomy, it makes sense that we're going to focus on abortion because it is an issue that arises when we're thinking about autonomy. So abortion causes us to think about individuals, about their freedom, the bodily autonomy that they have, their rights, their liberties, their duties to others, and questions of justified infringement on that freedom. Now, up in these images, the top image is Judith Jarvis Thompson, of course, who thought about abortion from the perspective of what a good Samaritan would owe another human being. David Bunin-Vale is another who I think emphasizes this individual freedom aspect of in approaching abortion. The two pictures below David Bunin, are Tommy Shelby and Emmeline Davis. And so Tommy Shelby really approaches the question of abortion differently, asking about reproductive responsibility. And Davis criticizes him, as we're going to see in just a minute, and instead suggests that we focus on reproductive flourishing. And then my suggestion is going to be, and we'll get to this in a minute, that we build on Davis's view and focus on histories of systemic racism that have led to these current outcomes, not just with regard to abortion, but also with regard to family policing and maternal mortality. And I'm going to argue that we should focus on social change for reproductive justice, reproductive flourishing. So in her 2022 paper that came out recently, Procreative Justice Reconceived, Davis critiques Tommy Shelby, who argues, and this is in his book, Dark Ghettos from 2016, who argues, Davis argues that Shelby trains his gaze on single poor women and asks, as a central question, whether there is a valid justification for welfare policies that deter reproduction among poor single women. Shelby endorses what he calls the reproductive responsibility principle, or RPP, according to which you should not bring a person into existence when you know or should know that it is highly unlikely that you will be able to fulfill the obligations thereby created. Davis argues that Shelby's view engenders a, quote, flawed understanding of Black women's reproductive lives. And she argues that we should shift our focus. We should not focus on the individual and their choices, because when we do that, we perpetuate systems of oppression that train their gaze on the individual and avoid focusing on a system. So Davis argues that we should shift our lens from the question, is it responsible for this person to procreate, which is the question Shelby asks, to the question, what is needed in order for this person to experience reproductive flourishing? And here's a quote from Davis. She says, the representation of poverty as a problem that can be characterized and hence appropriately evaluated, even partially, in terms of individual choice or reproductive self-discipline, reinforces the oppression of poor Black women and girls. Sorry. So I want to urge that we construct a kind of holism, following along Davis's shift in focus to reproductive flourishing. And the question, what is needed for this person to experience reproductive flourishing? And I would argue that one of the things that is needed is to have a society that is attentive to histories of racial injustice, ongoing structural racisms, and a society committed to transformation. Furthermore, I argue that we need to think about what obligations society, government, and institutions like healthcare and education have to promote reproductive flourishing in the sustained acknowledgement of our history. And finally, that all three of these issues, all are aspects of reproductive justice and are interrelated: abortion, childbirth, and parenting, and so that we should treat them as such. So I really like Davis's shift to this focus about reproductive flourishing, and I argue that we should make this further shift in thinking about how society can become a society that promotes reproductive flourishing. So, I have several recommendations. The first is that we turn the investigative lens away from the usual objects of the investigation. That is to say, people who have abortions, families who experience maternal mortality, or families who experience state intrusions into parenting. Davis argues that focusing the moral gaze on individuals intrudes on these individuals without their consent. It objectifies them. It renders, she says, hypervisible sites of speculative inquiry, including the idea that, quote, Black women can be known or understood or explained, unquote. When such an inquiry is carried out from the authoritative perspective of the moral or political expert, she says, the moral gaze exerts a controlling force on those it is trained upon. Davis argues that knowers situated in a dominant group, as I am, with regard to Black, Brown, and Indigenous pregnant people, birth givers, and parents, if we focus on the individual, we cause this controlling gaze. So I argue that instead, the theorists should turn their gaze away from the individual, instead bring it to the systems with which the individual interacts, and then the individual, such as I am, can advocate for change without imposing a controlling gaze. Second, I argue that we should focus on the social structures that police pregnant people, constrain people who give birth, and intrude into the lives of families. And so I end with a few really specific recommendations. These recommendations follow Dorothy Roberts, which she calls non-reformist reforms, and these come from her book Torn Apart, which I mentioned earlier, and she is on the right-hand side of your screen there. Non-reformist reforms are changes that identify approaches to these issues that I've talked about, reproductive justice, that weaken rather than strengthen controlling social systems. And so here's a non-exhaustive list of some approaches that would weaken rather than strengthen these social systems. Provide accurate education about sex and sexuality. Provide free and easily accessible contraception. Provide increase and provide more funding for freestanding birth centers, which are birth centers that exist outside of hospitals. Increase funding to access midwives, to increase funding to access home birth. Right now, home births are typically not covered in the United States by insurance. And so even though they're much less expensive overall, they're much more expensive for birth givers and their families because they have to pay for them out of pocket. Also, decrease funding for policing families or cease policing families. And similarly, increase funding to eliminate child poverty, provide free meals at school for all children, provide a universal basic income for parents, or indeed for all. Overall, I argue that we should focus not on what individuals may do, have a right to do, or free to do, but instead focus on the obligations of society, government, and institutions to provide accurate and informative education about sex, pregnancy, and sexuality, safe birth giving, and circumstances in which adults can provide for their family, like universal basic income and proposals that will eliminate child poverty. Okay, thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen so I can see you all again. There's my email. Please feel free to be in touch. I would love to hear from you by email.